The hallways of the LAPD's Van Nuys station were bustling with the usual morning energy in June 2009. Detectives sipped coffee and swapped case notes, unaware that a tactical team was moving into position within their own walls. At the center of the storm was Stephanie Lazarus, a highly respected veteran and a specialist in high-end art theft. She was a woman who had spent over 2 decades climbing the ranks, earning the trust of her peers while hiding a secret that would shatter the department's reputation. As she was led away in handcuffs, the shock wasn't just that a detective had been arrested. It was the realization that the killer they had been hunting since 1986 had been sitting in the desk right next to them. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. In the mid-1980s, Sherri Rasmussen was the quintessential picture of success and vitality in Los Angeles. At 29 years old, she had already established herself as a powerhouse in the medical field, serving as the director of nursing at the Adventist Medical Center in Glendale. To those who knew her, Sherri was more than just a title. She was a woman of immense intelligence and boundless empathy who had climbed the professional ladder with a grace that left many in awe. She was tall, blonde, and possessed a radiant energy that seemed to light up every room she entered, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of the city she served. Her life was a meticulously woven tapestry of ambition and kindness, and by 1985, she believed she had finally found the partner who would share in her bright future. John Retton was a handsome, athletic engineer who seemed to be Sherri's perfect match. When they met, the connection was almost instantaneous. They were both young professionals with their lives ahead of them, sharing a love for the outdoors and a drive for success. To Sherri, John was the grounding force she needed, a man who appreciated her strength and independence. Their romance was the kind that friends envied, filled with weekend trips and quiet evenings planning a life together. By the time they decided to marry in November 1985, their world seemed impenetrable. They purchased a beautiful townhouse in Van Nuys, a quiet suburb where they hoped to build a family. It was a time of pure optimism, the kind of era where the biggest worry was choosing the right furniture or balancing demanding careers. However, beneath the surface of this idyllic union, there was a history John hadn't fully reconciled, a lingering shadow from his past named Stephanie Lazarus. John and Stephanie had met years earlier during their time at Oklahoma State University. They had a casual, on-and-off relationship that spanned several years, but for John, it was never a serious commitment. He viewed Stephanie as a close friend with whom he occasionally shared more, but he never intended for her to be his wife. Stephanie, however, viewed the situation through a much more obsessive lens. To her, John wasn't just a former flame. He was the one who got away, the man she believed was rightfully hers. When John told Stephanie that he was engaged to Sherri, the news didn't just hurt her, it ignited a pathological jealousy that would simmer for months. Stephanie, who was then a young patrol officer with the LAPD, was not a woman who handled rejection with dignity. She was competitive, driven, and possessed a rigid sense of ownership over the people in her life. While John moved forward with wedding plans, Stephanie remained trapped in a cycle of resentment. She reached out to him repeatedly, expressing her heartbreak and even inviting him to her apartment to talk about his decision. John, perhaps out of a misplaced sense of loyalty to an old friend or a naive belief that she just needed closure, stayed in contact with her longer than he should have. Sherri, with her sharp intuition, sensed the intrusion immediately. She was a woman who valued honesty and directness, and the presence of this old friend in John's life felt like a jagged edge in their relationship. There were uncomfortable encounters, times when Stephanie would show up unannounced, using her status as a police officer to exert a subtle, chilling pressure. On one occasion, Stephanie appeared at the hospital where Sherri worked, dressed in her full LAPD uniform. She wasn't there for a medical reason. She was there to mark her territory. She made it clear to Sherri that she had a long history with John and that she wasn't going anywhere. For Sherri, this was no longer just a crazy ex story. It was a targeted campaign of harassment from someone who carried a badge and a gun. Sherri pleaded with John to handle the situation, expressing her growing fear that Stephanie was unstable. She told her father, Nels Rasmussen, about the blonde policewoman who wouldn't leave them alone. Nels, a man who adored his daughter, felt a chill when Sherri described the interactions. He urged his daughter to be careful, but in the optimistic haze of a new marriage, it was hard to imagine that a professional peer, a guardian of the law, could be a legitimate physical threat. They believed that once the wedding was over and their life in Van Nuys truly began, the shadow of Stephanie Lazarus would finally dissipate. They couldn't have known that for Stephanie, the marriage wasn't the end of the story. It was the ultimate provocation. As Sherri settled into her new home, decorating the rooms and excelling in her career, she was unknowingly being watched by a woman who viewed her happiness as a personal theft. The collision between Sherri's bright, promising world and Stephanie's dark, obsessive one was no longer a matter of if, but when. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the winter of 1986, one must look closely at the woman who walked the thin blue line by day and nurtured a toxic obsession by night. Stephanie Lazarus was born in 1960 into a world that demanded discipline and achievement. By the time she joined the Los Angeles Police Department in the early 80s, she was a woman defined by her tenacity and a desperate need to belong to an elite tier of society. She was athletic, competitive, and possessed a blunt, almost clinical way of interacting with the world, traits that made her an effective officer, but often left her personal relationships strained and one-sided. The central pillar of Stephanie's emotional world was John Ruetten. They had met at Oklahoma State University, where they both lived in the same dorm. To John, Stephanie was a comfortable companion, a buddy, with whom he shared a physical connection and a mutual love for sports. To Stephanie, however, John was the ultimate prize. He represented the kind of stable, successful, middle-class life she craved. She didn't just love him, she felt a sense of ownership over him. Their relationship was a long-distance, intermittent affair that followed them back to Southern California after graduation. While John was moving on, building his career as an engineer and seeking a partner who challenged and inspired him, Stephanie was still keeping score. She kept every letter he wrote, every memento of their time together, meticulously filing them away like evidence in a case she refused to close. The psychological shift in Stephanie occurred when John introduced her to Sherri Rasmussen. For a woman as competitive as Stephanie, Sherri wasn't just a girlfriend. She was an adversary who had won the life Stephanie believed was hers by right. Sherri was everything Stephanie was not. She was high-ranking in the medical world, she was conventionally beautiful, and she possessed a natural warmth that drew people in effortlessly. When John and Sherri announced their engagement in 1985, Stephanie's internal world began to fracture. She wrote in her journal about her profound despair and sadness. But these emotions quickly curdled into something far more dangerous, a focused, predatory resentment. Stephanie did not retreat. Instead, she used her badge as a tool of intimidation. On multiple occasions, she appeared at the couple's home and at Sherri's workplace, often under the guise of checking in on John. These weren't the actions of a heartbroken ex-lover. They were the calculated maneuvers of a stalker who understood the power of her uniform. She knew that as an LAPD officer, she occupied a position of inherent trust and authority. If Sherri complained, who would the police believe? Their fellow officer or a jealous wife? Stephanie was essentially gaslighting the couple, forcing her presence into their most private moments. In the months leading up to the murder, Stephanie's behavior became increasingly erratic. She once showed up at their townhouse while John was away, and Sherri was home alone. She claimed she needed to pick up some old belongings, but the items she took, a set of old skis, were merely an excuse to stand in Sherri's living room, to breathe the same air, and to let Sherri know that she could bypass any lock. Sherri was terrified. She told her friends and family that she felt like she was being hunted. She specifically told John that Stephanie was crazy and begged him to make her stay away. But John, perhaps trapped in the nice guy trope, continued to believe he could manage Stephanie's emotions through occasional conversation, not realizing he was feeding a fire that was already out of control. Stephanie's obsession was further fueled by her professional life. As she moved through the ranks of the LAPD, she was learning exactly how the system worked. She knew how crime scenes were processed, how evidence was gathered, and more importantly, how investigations could be steered or stalled. She was a student of the blue wall of silence, the unspoken rule that officers protect their own. She understood that if she were to commit a crime, her best shield would be the very department she served. The internal pressure reached a boiling point in early 1986. John and Sherri had been married for only 3 months. They were happy, they were successful, and they were planning a future that did not include Stephanie. For Stephanie, this was the ultimate rejection. She began to see Sherri not just as a rival, but as a parasite that had attached itself to the life Stephanie deserved. She began to plan. She didn't want John back as much as she wanted Sherri gone. She needed to erase the error that John had made in choosing someone else. In late January 1986, Stephanie reported her personal .38 caliber Smith & Wesson snub-nosed revolver stolen from her car while she was at a shopping mall. It was a classic police report move, creating a paper trail for a missing weapon that would later be used in a homicide. By reporting it stolen, she provided herself with an alibi for the weapon's disappearance. She was already thinking like a detective, even as she prepared to become a killer. She was cold, methodical, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. She believed she could outsmart the science, outsmart her colleagues, and outsmart the Rasmussens. She was the shadow in the hallway, the officer on the beat, and the jilted lover with a badge, all converging into a single, lethal intent. As February 24th approached, Stephanie wasn't just an officer doing her duty, she was a woman preparing for a confrontation she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. She knew John's schedule. She knew Sherri would be home. She knew exactly which door to knock on and what she would do when it opened. The tragedy of Sherri Rasmussen wasn't just that she was murdered. It was that her killer was someone who had sworn an oath to protect the very community Sherri lived in. Stephanie Lazarus was the wolf who had learned to wear the shepherd's clothes perfectly. The morning of February 24, 1986, began like any other Monday in the Van Nuys townhouse of John and Sherri Retton. John left for work early, leaving Sherri behind. She had decided to take the day off to rest, a rare luxury for a woman who spent most of her waking hours managing a hospital staff. The house was quiet, the neighborhood was still, and for a few hours, Sherri was alone in the sanctuary she and her husband had built. But outside, a different kind of mourning was unfolding. Stephanie Lazarus, a woman who knew John's schedule as well as he did, was no longer content with watching from the sidelines. She was armed, she was prepared, and she had reached a point of no return. The confrontation began not with a forced entry, but likely with a knock or a familiar face. There were no signs that the front door had been kicked in. Stephanie likely used her status or a pretext to get inside. Once the threshold was crossed, the atmosphere in the townhouse shifted from domestic peace to a frantic, primal struggle for survival. Sherri Rasmussen was not a woman who gave up easily. Despite the surprise of the attack, she fought back with every ounce of strength she possessed. The two women, one a healer, the other a protector, turned predator, engaged in a violent battle that spilled across the living room floor. The evidence of this struggle was carved into the very walls of the home. Furniture was overturned, and a ceramic vase was shattered, its shards scattered like jagged glass across the carpet. Sherri was a tall, athletic woman, and she used her reach to fend off her attacker. At some point during the melee, the physical proximity became so close that Stephanie, driven by a desperate, animalistic rage, sunk her teeth into Sherri's forearm. It was a bite of such intensity that it left a deep, bruised impression, a mark of literal ownership and hatred that would, decades later, become the silent witness to the truth. As the struggle intensified, the attacker realized that physical strength alone might not finish the job. Sherri was fighting too hard. She was too resilient. Stephanie reached for her weapon, the .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver she had strategically lost just weeks prior. But the fight wasn't over. Sherri lunged for the gun, or perhaps tried to shield herself, and in the chaos, shots rang out. The sound was muffled by the walls of the townhouse, unheard by neighbors who were busy with their own morning routines. The first 2 shots struck Sherri in the torso, but she continued to move, her body fueled by pure adrenaline and the desperate will to live. The final, fatal shot was delivered at point-blank range, a cold and calculated execution. The bullet entered Sherri's chest, ending the struggle instantly. The director of nursing, the woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, lay dead on her own living room floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her life. Stephanie Lazarus didn't panic. She had been trained for this. She knew that a clean crime scene was a suspicious one. To mask her true motive, a crime of passion and obsession, she began to stage a robbery. She moved through the house with clinical precision. She pulled drawers open, scattering their contents to create a sense of hurried ransacking. She walked over to the electronic equipment, unplugging the VCR and placing it near the door, as if an intruder had intended to take it but was interrupted. She was creating a narrative that her colleagues would find easy to believe, a burglary gone wrong in a city plagued by rising crime rates. Before leaving, she took one final cold-blooded step. She walked out to the driveway and stole Sherri's silver BMW. It served two purposes. It provided a getaway vehicle that wouldn't be linked to her, and it reinforced the robbery-homicide theory. She drove away from the quiet Van Nuys street, leaving behind a shattered home and a woman who had been her only obstacle to the life she wanted. By the time John Retton returned home that evening, the scene was one of incomprehensible horror. He found his wife lying in the entryway, her body cold, the house a shambles. He called the police, the very department where Stephanie Lazarus was likely beginning her shift or filing her own reports. When the investigators arrived, they saw exactly what Stephanie wanted them to see. They saw the overturned furniture, the missing car, and the displaced electronics. They saw a tragedy, but they failed to see the signature of one of their own. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was noted by the medical examiner, but in 1986, DNA technology was in its infancy. It was viewed as a piece of physical evidence, perhaps a sign of a struggle with a particularly violent male intruder. Stephanie had banked on the limitations of science and the biases of her peers. She knew that the police would look for a stranger, a career criminal, or a drifter. They wouldn't look for a fellow officer with a broken heart and a .38 Smith & Wesson. As the sun set on Van Nuys that day, Stephanie Lazarus began the longest cover-up of her career. She had killed the woman who stole her husband, and she had done so using the very skills the city had paid her to learn. She was no longer just a detective. She was a ghost in the system, a killer hiding behind a shield, confident that the secrets of February 24th would remain buried in the evidence locker forever. She didn't realize that the bite she had left on Sherri's arm was a ticking time bomb, a piece of her own identity that Sherri would carry into the afterlife, waiting for the world to catch up to the truth. The arrival of the LAPD at the Rueton townhouse on the evening of February 24th, 1986, marked the beginning of an investigation that would be defined more by what was ignored than what was found. To the lead detectives on the scene, the narrative seemed obvious. Los Angeles was in the grip of a violent era, and a young woman murdered in a ransacked home screamed, "Burglary gone wrong." They saw the electronic equipment sitting by the door and the missing silver BMW as the calling cards of desperate criminals. Stephanie Lazarus had played her part perfectly. The staging was effective enough to convince her colleagues that the killer was a stranger. However, the robbery theory had gaping holes that a more critical eye should have spotted. While some items were displaced, many high-value objects remained untouched. More importantly, the sheer brutality of the attack, the prolonged struggle, and the point-blank execution suggested a level of personal hatred that rarely accompanies a simple theft. Yet, the investigators were locked into their initial premise. They weren't looking for a motive, they were looking for a type of person, a male intruder, likely a drifter or a local thief. While the police followed leads that went nowhere, Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, was beginning his own relentless pursuit of the truth. Nels was a man of deep convictions, and he knew his daughter. He knew about the blonde policewoman who had been stalking Sherri in the months before her death. Almost immediately, Nels began telling the detectives that they were looking in the wrong direction. He practically handed them the name, Stephanie Lazarus. He told them about the time she showed up at the hospital in full uniform to intimidate Sherri. He told them about her unannounced visits to the townhouse. The response from the LAPD was a masterclass in institutional dismissal. Whenever Nels brought up the policewoman girlfriend of John Rueton, he was met with a wall of skepticism. The lead detective, Lyle Mayer, reportedly told Nels that he watched too much television and that his theory was preposterous. Within the department, Stephanie was a known entity, a rising star. The idea that a fellow officer, someone they saw at the gym, someone who shared their badge, could be a cold-blooded killer was a bridge too far for the investigators of 1986. They preferred the comfort of the anonymous criminal narrative over the terrifying possibility of a traitor in their ranks. Nels Rasmussen did not back down. He was a constant presence at the station, a grieving father who refused to let his daughter's case go cold. He wrote letters to the chief of police, he demanded meetings with supervisors, and he kept meticulous notes of every interaction. But the more he pushed, the more the department pulled away. The case file began to gather dust. The silver BMW was eventually found abandoned a few miles away, but it yielded no fingerprints that matched the criminal databases of the time. The DNA from the bite mark on Sherri's arm was preserved in a glass vial, but it sat in an evidence locker, a biological relic that the 1980s didn't have the keys to unlock. Throughout this period, Stephanie Lazarus continued her life as if nothing had happened. She worked her beats, she earned commendations, and she even occasionally saw John Rutan. For John, the grief was overwhelming, and in the absence of any other suspects, he struggled to reconcile his past with Stephanie with the horror of his present. He too was a victim of the blue wall. He had been interviewed, of course, but his alibi was solid. The police never seriously investigated the woman he had once dated because they had already decided who the killer was, and it wasn't a cop. The botched robbery theory became the official truth, a convenient lie that protected the department's image and allowed a murderer to hide in plain sight. For over 20 years, the file on Sherri Rasmussen remained dormant, classified as uncleared. To the LAPD, it was a tragic statistic of a violent decade. To Nels Rasmussen, it was an open wound that refused to heal. He watched as Stephanie Lazarus was promoted to detective, then to a specialist in the prestigious art theft detail. He watched her build a career and a life, all while his daughter's life remained a frozen moment of violence that the world had chosen to forget. Nels's fight was a lonely one. He was fighting a system that was designed to protect itself, a system that viewed his persistence as a nuisance rather than a quest for justice. But his refusal to stay silent was the only thing that kept Sherri's memory from being completely erased by the bureaucracy of the LAPD. He was waiting for the world to catch up to what he already knew in his heart. He was waiting for a day when the badge wouldn't be enough to hide the bite mark. As the 80s bled into the 90s, and the 90s into the new millennium, the case of Sherri Rasmussen seemed destined to remain one of the city's great unsolved mysteries, until the science of the future finally arrived to settle the debts of the past. For nearly 2 decades, the case of Sherri Rasmussen remained a stagnant file in the LAPD's archives. To the world, Sherri was a tragic statistic of 1980s Los Angeles. To her father, Nels, she was a daughter whose killer was walking the halls of justice. By 2004, the landscape of criminal investigation had shifted fundamentally with the maturation of DNA technology. It was no longer a theoretical science but a precision tool that could pull a name out of a microscopic sample of saliva. Inside the LAPD's Scientific Investigation Division, a concerted effort began to re-examine thousands of cold cases where biological evidence had been preserved. The turning point came when Jennifer Francis, a criminalist, pulled the Rasmussen file. Among the yellowing papers and grainy photographs, she found a reference to the bite mark on Sherri's arm. In 1986, the medical examiner had taken a swab of that wound, and against all odds, that tiny glass vial had remained intact within the evidence locker for 23 years. When Francis analyzed the sample, the results shattered the botched robbery narrative that had protected the killer for a generation. The DNA profile extracted from the bite mark did not belong to a man. It was undeniably genetically female. This revelation sent a shockwave through the small group of detectives now handling the case. For 20 years, the LAPD had been searching for 2 male suspects based on the initial robbery theory. Now, the science was telling them that the primary aggressor, the person who had sunk their teeth into Sherri's flesh, was a woman. Despite this breakthrough, the case stalled again. The female DNA didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. It was a profile without a name. In 2009, Detective Jim Nuttall and his partner Pete Barba took over the investigation. They didn't just look at the new DNA, they looked at the old notes. Specifically, they looked at the persistent, desperate pleas of Nels Rasmussen. The father's notes mentioned a blonde policewoman who had been obsessed with John Ruetten. When the detectives searched the LAPD personnel records from 1986, one name rose to the surface like a ghost: Stephanie Lazarus. By now, Lazarus was a high-profile detective in the art theft detail. She was a respected veteran, a peer, and a friend to many in the department. Investigating her was a political and professional minefield. If they were wrong, they would destroy a colleague's career. If they were right, they were exposing a monster within their own house. They began a covert operation, treating one of their own like a high-stakes target. They couldn't simply ask for her DNA, they had to steal it. The surveillance team followed Lazarus as she went about her mundane life in 2009. They watched her go to the gym, run errands, and pick up her daughter. The moment of truth came at a local Costco. Lazarus finished a soda and tossed the plastic cup into a trash bin. The detectives waited until she moved away, then retrieved the cup, sealing it as the most important piece of evidence in LAPD history. The laboratory comparison was a binary moment of justice. The DNA from the soda cup, the saliva of Detective Stephanie Lazarus, was an identical match to the DNA found in the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm. The science had bridged the 23-year gap. The policewoman Nels had warned them about wasn't a theory. She was a genetic certainty. The shadow that had haunted the Rasmussen family since 1986 finally had a face, a badge number, and a desk in the Van Nuys station. The cold case hadn't just awakened, it had arrived at the front door of the killer. On the morning of June 5, 2009, the trap was finally set. The LAPD faced a delicate challenge: how to arrest a high-ranking detective within a secure police facility without triggering a violent standoff. The investigators decided on a ruse, inviting Stephanie Lazarus to a room in the basement of the Parker Center under the guise of discussing a suspect in an art theft case. She arrived calm and professional, carrying herself with the practiced confidence of a veteran. She had no idea that the suspect she was there to discuss was actually herself. The interrogation, captured on video, remains one of the most chilling pieces of forensic psychology in modern history. Detectives Jim Nuttall and Dan Jaramillo began with mundane work talk before pivoting sharply to her past. When the name John Ruetten was mentioned, the atmosphere in the room visibly shifted. Lazarus, a master of interrogation herself, immediately began to employ defensive maneuvers. She feigned a foggy memory, repeating that the relationship was a million years ago and that she couldn't quite remember the details of her interactions with Sherri. As the detectives pressed further, her professional veneer began to crack. She didn't display the outrage of an innocent person wrongly accused. Instead, she exhibited the wary, calculated movements of a cornered predator. When they asked if she had ever had a physical confrontation with Sherri, her denials were hollow and punctuated by long, heavy silences. The moment they informed her that her DNA had been found at the crime scene, the game was over. She stood up, attempting to end the interview and walk out back to her desk, but she was met by a wall of fellow officers. The downfall was swift. Stephanie Lazarus was stripped of her badge and gun, the very symbols of authority she had used to mask her crime for 23 years. In 2012, her trial became a media sensation. The prosecution presented the smoking gun, the biological evidence that proved she had bitten Sherri Rasmussen during a lethal struggle. The jury saw the letters she had written to John's mother, the journal entries detailing her obsession, and the evidence of her reported stolen gun. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Stephanie Lazarus, the decorated detective, was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. As she was led away, the blue wall she had hidden behind for so long finally crumbled, leaving her to face the reality that no badge could protect her from the truth. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus brought a somber closure to a case that had haunted the LAPD for nearly a quarter of a century. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, it was a bittersweet victory, a validation of their 23-year struggle against an institution that had chosen to protect its own reputation over the life of their daughter. The case remains a stark reminder of the blue wall of silence and the dangers of professional manipulation, showing how easily a badge can become a mask for a predator. While Lazarus finally faced justice, the legacy of her crime is a fractured trust that took decades to begin mending. Sherri Rasmussen's story is no longer a botched robbery lost in the archives, but a testament to the power of persistence and the eventual undeniable clarity of truth. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.